are two ways of claiming that the public, c'est moi. One is practiced by the crude material parasite who clamors for government handouts in the name of a public need and pockets what he has not earned. The other is practiced by his leader, the spiritual parasite, who derives his illusion of greatness, like a fence receiving stolen goods, from the power to dispose of that which he has not earned, and from the mystic view of himself as the embodied voice of the public. Of the two, the material parasite is psychologically healthier and closer to reality. At least he eats or wears his loot. But the only source of satisfaction open to the spiritual parasite, his only means to gain prestige, apart from giving orders and spreading terror, is the most wasteful, useless, and meaningless activity of all, the building of public monuments. Greatness is achieved by the productive effort of a man's mind in the pursuit of clearly defined rational goals. But a delusion of grandeur can be served only by the switching, undefinable chimera of a public monument, which is presented as a munificent gift to the victims whose forced labor or extorted money had paid for it, which is dedicated to the service of all and none, owned by all and none, gaped at by all and enjoyed by none. This is the ruler's only way to appease his obsession, prestige. Prestige in whose eyes? In anyone's. In the eyes of his tortured victims, of the beggars in the streets of his kingdom, of the bootlickers at his court, of the foreign tribes and their rulers beyond the borders. It is to impress all those eyes, the eyes of everyone and no one, that the blood of generations of subjects has been spilled and spent. One may see, in certain biblical movies, a graphic image of the meaning of public monument building, the building of the pyramids. Hordes of starved, ragged, emaciated men straining the last effort of their inadequate muscles at the inhuman task of pulling the ropes that drag large chunks of stone, straining like tortured beasts of burden under the whips of overseers, collapsing on the job and dying in the desert sands, that a dead pharaoh might lie in an impossibly senseless structure and thus gain eternal prestige in the eyes of the unborn of future generations. Temples and palaces are the only monuments left of mankind's early civilizations. They were created by the same means and at the same price, a price not justified by the fact that primitive peoples undoubtedly believed, while dying of starvation and exhaustion, that the prestige of their tribe, their rulers, or their gods was of value to them somehow. Rome fell, bankrupted by statist controls and taxation, while its emperors were building colosseums. Louis XIV of France taxed his people into a state of indigence while he built the Palace of Versailles for his contemporary monarchs to envy and for modern tourists to visit. The marble-lined Moscow subway, built by the unpaid volunteer labor of Russian workers, including women, is a public monument, and so is the czarist-like luxury of the champagne and caviar receptions at the Soviet embassies, which is needed, while the people stand in line for inadequate food rations, to maintain the prestige of the Soviet Union. The great distinction of the United States of America up to the last few decades was the modesty of its public monuments. Such monuments as did exist were genuine. They were not erected for prestige, but were functional structures that had housed events of great historical importance. If you have seen the austere simplicity of Independence Hall, you have seen the difference between authentic grandeur and the pyramids of public-spirited prestige-seekers. In America, human effort and material resources were not expropriated for public monuments and public projects, but were spent on the progress of the private, personal, individual well-being of individual citizens. America's greatness lies in the fact that her actual monuments are not public. The skyline of New York is a monument of a splendor that no pyramids or palaces will ever equal or approach. But America's skyscrapers were not built by public funds nor for a public purpose. They were built by the energy, initiative, and wealth of private individuals for personal profit. And instead of impoverishing the people, these skyscrapers, as they rose higher and higher, kept raising the people's standard of living, including the inhabitants of the slums, who lead a life of luxury compared to the life of an ancient Egyptian slave or of a modern Soviet socialist worker. Such is the difference, both in theory and practice, between capitalism and socialism. It is impossible to compute the human suffering, degradation, deprivation, and horror that went to pay for a single much-touted skyscraper of Moscow, or for the Soviet factories or mines or dams, or for any part of their loot and blood-supported industrialization. What we do know, however, is that 45 years is a long time. It is the span of 2 generations. We do know that, in the name of a promised abundance, 2 generations of human beings have lived and died in subhuman poverty. And we do know that today's advocates of socialism are not deterred by a fact of this kind. Whatever motive they might assert, benevolence is one they have long since lost the right to claim. The ideology of socialization, in a neo-fascist form, is now floating by default through the vacuum of our intellectual and cultural atmosphere. Observe how often we are asked for undefined sacrifices to unspecified purposes. Observe how often the present administration is invoking the public interest. Observe what prominence the issue of international prestige has suddenly acquired, and what grotesquely suicidal policies are justified by references to matters of prestige. Observe that during the recent Cuban crisis, when the factual issue concerned nuclear missiles and nuclear war, our diplomats and commentators found it proper seriously to weigh such things as the prestige, the personal feelings, and the face-saving of the sundry socialist rulers involved. There is no difference between the principles, policies, and practical results of socialism and those of any historical or prehistorical tyranny. Socialism is merely democratic absolute monarchy. That is, a system of absolutism without a fixed head, open to seizure of power by all comers, by any ruthless climber, opportunist, adventurer, demagogue, or thug. When you consider socialism, do not fool yourself about its nature. Remember that there is no such dichotomy as human rights versus property rights. No human rights can exist without property rights. Since material goods are produced by the mind and effort of individual men and are needed to sustain their lives, if the producer does not own the result of his effort, he does not own his life. To deny property rights means to turn men into property owned by the state. Whoever claims the right to redistribute the wealth produced by others is claiming the right to treat human beings as chattel. When you consider the global devastation perpetrated by socialism, the sea of blood and the millions of victims, remember that they were sacrificed not for the good of mankind, nor for any noble ideal, but for the festering vanity of some scared brute or some pretentious mediocrity who craved a mantle of unearned greatness, and that the monument to socialism is a pyramid of public factories, public theaters, and public parks, erected on a foundation of human corpses, with the figure of the ruler posturing on top, beating his chest and screaming his plea for prestige to the starless void above him. December 1962.